Mr. Vulliamy, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview.
My honor.
Thank you. I would like to start off by talking about the first time you came here to the region. Was it just another assignment?
Yes, I'm an unintentional war correspondent. I hate war. That's why I write about it. I think some war correspondents rather enjoy war, but I hate it. I prefer peace, and that's why I write about war. And I was living in Italy, in Rome, attempting to combine La Dolce Vita with work on the mafia and football and other things. And I got a call one morning in June 1991 from the foreign desk saying there's something strange going on in Slovenia. This would have been June or July. Could you go and check it out to see what's happening? You're next door, get a car from Trieste. And so I drove through Ljubljana up to the north of Slovenia, and were kind of guys with hunting rifles and the Yugoslav National People's Army, and little did I know that this was the beginning of the carnage that didn't end until the end of 1995.
Mm. And then you came to Bosnia after that.
Yes, I first came to Bosnia on assignment, as it were, in 1992, having covered the war in Croatia. I mean, so I had exposed myself to and started to try and understand the horrors of Vukovar and Osijek and Vinkovci and places like that before coming here. But it was very different. In a way, the war in Croatia was fought by agreement. Both sides wanted what they were fighting for, whereas here it was completely different. It was just a hurricane of violence against the people who I really don't think were expecting it. And my first kind of my arrival was first of all a challenge from Radovan Karadzic in London when reports of the camps at Omarska and elsewhere were being written about, largely on the basis of testimony from relatives arriving in Karlovac in Croatia. And Karadzic denied all this on television in London. He said, "This is not true, come and see for yourself." I don't know why he said that, and I still don't know why he said that. So we said, yeah, okay, we will. What he wasn't expecting was for myself and the crew from ITN to arrive in Belgrade the next day saying, well, when are we going? So we got kind of messed around for a few days and went by helicopter to Pale. So that's when I first touched ground, if you like. An unforgettably scary and weird lunch with Dr. Karadzic, after which we managed to finally, through a lot of hurdles, get our way through the back gate of the Omarska concentration camp. That was August the 5th, 1992. And for obvious reasons, it's a day I will never and could never forget. And my feelings are irrelevant. It's the day the people who were in there will never forget that time in their lives. And that was the beginning, for me, of 3 long years.
So you came here, and the first story that you covered
was
Did you feel suitably prepared for coming to Bosnia and for what you were to encounter here?
Well, I'd been in Iraq and I'd been in Vukovar, but nothing with respect to those 2 awful things can prepare you for the sight of men with shaven heads, skeletal, running across a tarmac yard out of a hangar where God knows what's happening in there. We now know what was happening in there. To a canteen, wolfing down watery stew like hungry dogs. Unbelievable. They were allowed to. We were allowed to talk to them under the eye of the guards. They were allowed to talk to us if they dared, which they didn't. The guards swinging their guns, apart from one man who said, "I do not want to tell any lies, but I cannot tell the truth." It was, I think, something like 14 years later. I was at a meeting in London, and he walked into the room. I nearly fell off my chair. His name was Jamal Paratusic. He lives just north of London. He survived. Yes, so that day has stayed with me forever, and, well, but that's an understatement. It has stayed with those who survived it forever, very differently, more deeply, and far more traumatically than anything I could feel. But it was quite a way to start.
When I spoke to Ron Haviv about the consequences of what he had encountered in Prijedor, I believe, he said, the sense that I got was that he was, that this is something that stayed with him for quite a long time. Was it the same for you?
Yeah, I've been haunted by the whole thing. I mean, I had a bad accident 3 years ago, which involved me, and I don't mind saying this. I've written it. I jumped off a wall. I thought in trauma, jumping for cover, because a drill, building foundations for a building, were going boom, 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 and I had a flashback. So yeah, I mean, if you're allowed to say this on BHTV, we're fucked up people. However, we're wiser for what we know. I mean, there is I've often wondered, do I regret ever having set foot in this country, or would I do it all again? I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. I mean, my life would have been happier and different if I'd never come here. But on the other hand, I've made friends and established bonds here, and now this book. So yeah, I probably would do it all again. But I mean, of course it stays with you. I mean, what this city that we're sitting in, and what this country generally suffered, survived, if it did survive, that's a question. It should not happen to anybody, but it did. So we know more. My favourite poem is by an English poet called Samuel Taylor Coleridge, called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And it's basically this old git who pins a wedding guest to the wall during a party with his tale of woe. And I feel a bit like the ancient mariner, I start to feel sorry for the wedding guest who just wanted to go and have a drink and meet the bridesmaids, and he gets pinned by this old git. Every time I meet a musician, it occurs to me that their job is to make people happy and fulfilled and uplifted. Mine is to make them miserable. And I'm not sure whether that's such a great role in life.
Well, Ozymandias is my favorite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, very, very similar.
But I got the idea to do the book, not because I wanted to go back. I'd already done a book on the war that came out during the war. Not so much a book as a sort of outburst of rage in 1993. But I wanted to do this book, which isn't about the war. It's about the 20 years after it, for the people who survived it or were bereaved. When I was in Prague, talking to a lady who survived Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen, and I said to her, Mrs. Hoshkowitz, often in journalism, it's a stupid question that gets a good answer. It shouldn't be true, but it sometimes is. I said, Mrs. Hoshkowitz, how did you survive? And she looked at me and said, young man, is that a question? How do you know I survived? It's a bloody good answer. And that got me thinking, how do I know they survived? In St. Louis, Missouri, in Watford, in Holland, in Denmark, through the outskirts of all these towns through which the diaspora has been scattered and shattered by what happened, and the ones who've come back to rebuild their burned out houses and hang on in here. How do I know they survived? And that was the question that I kind of needed answering. Yeah. And the book doesn't offer an answer, really. I did ask Fikret Alic, the famous, to his poor Fikret, the famous man behind the barbed wire with the rib cage. I said, Fikret, how did you survive? And he answered me in English, Eddie, I survived because I am a man who can laugh. And it's not a joke, but it's a wonderful answer. And in his case, I hope, touch wood, it's true. But that's what I set out to do. What is survival? What is the reckoning? It's not about the war. It's about the people in the 2 decades that followed the war, which is in a way more important and interesting, because wars come and go, and we can't expect the newspapers of the world to talk about Bosnia every day, because there are other things going on, sadly. But the flip side of that means that the people who are, as I say, scattered and shattered by the war, festering in their houses, doing their best, driving trucks or drinking too much or managing well in business, I don't know, in America or Germany or Holland or London or back here, what happened to these people? That's why the book has the title that it does, which actually probably needs some explaining in Boston.
I was going to ask you about
long live
that.
the war. Well, I mean, I am anything but a monarchist. I'm not only a Republican, I am an anti-monarchist. I'm a Jacobin. But there is a saying: when the monarch dies in the United Kingdom, the king is dead. Long live the king. It means that one's gone, here comes the next. So the idea was to sort of say that the war, it's not like a football match. You don't blow the whistle and it's over. The extra time goes on forever in a war. It can, for those who survive it or who are bereaved by it, it never really ends. And I think that's what we needed to do, was just to put it on the record, have it out there, that these people have not gone away just because they've been forgotten about by history, if they were ever remembered. And that's they're there, they're still there in Eindhoven and in Copenhagen and in Munich and in St. Louis and Salt Lake City and Watford and back here. They haven't gone away, and they still have the nightmares they have. And it gets quite, you have to roll up your sleeves with this. I mean, it's tough. There's a section on the violation of women, which was obviously, as we know, a systematic policy by the Bosnian Serbs to incarcerate women in sometimes quite large numbers, sometimes just a few, and violate them all night, every night. And the book has to talk to those women. And one of the most extraordinary sections of it, and I was grateful to a translator who actually called Edina, who I met when she was a child prisoner in Ternopil, age 7. At age 27, she became the translator on much of this. This is how it is. And she managed to sort of translate this extraordinary conversation by whispering into my ear between two women who almost forgot that we were there, as to whether or not the experience of serial violation had destroyed them or not. One of them said no, one of them said yes. And so it's the war had a macabre intimacy to it. The people in Omaska knew their torturers and their killers, and vice versa. It wasn't the same as the foot soldiers at Birkenau, just getting them off the train and into the ovens. They knew them. And so the book, in a way, has that same intimacy with the bereaved and the survivors, because it's eyeball to eyeball stuff.
Yeah.
And it requires incredible bravery and honesty on the part of all the people who've been interviewed for this book to tell their stories. I mean, my gratitude to them, it is beyond words. I couldn't do it.
Speaking of The Hague, you testified in a number of cases at The Hague, and you were the first journalist to do so in the history of the International War Crimes Tribunal. What was that like for you?
Yes, it's. I've got this kind of. I didn't choose it. Destiny has given me a long history with this institution in The Hague. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful to ByBook and this edition is because it's enabled me to update where we were when the book came out in English, because The Hague comes out of it pretty well in the English edition, but that needs revisiting, that judgment. Well, The Hague was set up as an act of it was ambition, because it's human rights, the zeitgeist, international justice, blah, blah, but also contrition, because the United Nations had, fecked up. In Irish we can say F-E-C-K, by the way, and it's allowed, it's a custom. I don't know how you manage that in Bosnia, but had fecked up so badly that they needed to sort of do something else to show that they weren't entirely useless. And I thought, well, I think at that time, 1995, when they first contacted me, it was, anything. I don't care whether it's called the ICTY or a Teletubby. I'll cooperate. And I did. I testified in 9 trials, and it was tough. A lot of colleagues disapproved of of testifying. They said that I was betraying the neutrality of the media. I said, well, look, I'm not neutral. Objective, yes, that's something different. That's fact specific. But neutrality, I'm not neutral between people who gang rape a woman and the woman. I'm not neutral between the camp guards torturing somebody who just happened to be a carpenter and a Bosniak, and that carpenter. I'm not neutral. And also, there is this thing called the law. I mean, if I see an old lady mugged out in the street and I'm called to testify at the trial of the guys who did it, I go along. People said, "Oh no, the press should be above this or separate from it." But what is this priesthood? Who elected us? So that was my thinking. But also just anything, And I think at The Hague, the achievement was not actually judicial. The achievement was that the story of what happened was set. It's there if you want to read it. These brave, bold people came to give what they called the witness testimony, and did so with such courage and raw honesty. But it is a judicial court. And did it work, didn't it? Yes, I think it's better that Milan Lukic is in jail for what he did in Visegrad than not in jail, even if the jail is basically like a 5-star hotel with pornographic television that he can watch or whatever he does. I understand that Karadzic and Gotovina played tennis together in The Hague, which shows how much they have in common, and so on. But in the end, I have to go with the judgment of the survivors and the bereaved. It's for them to judge whether this was worth it or not. And largely, the feeling is no. Too late. Too many lawyers have made too much money out of this. And crucially, in the verdicts, since the English edition came out, and it's terrific to be able to kind of rectify that in this edition of the book. We've had Karadzic acquitted of genocide for everything other than Srebrenica, which means that the world knows about Srebrenica, and quite rightly so. But that means that everything that happened in Prijedor, Vlasenica, Bijeljina, the list goes on and on and on. Your good viewers know the names. Chaplinia, indeed, Mostar, is not genocide. If what happened in and around Prijedor and elsewhere, Foča, Visegrad, whereby one race or ethnicity entirely obliterates another, either by deportation, death, and destroys all their buildings, all their places of worship and so on. And if that's not genocide, I don't know what is. So that's a failure. And we've had the release of these people like Gotovina, Perisic, Šešelj, apparently, so too ill to be in a prison cell, but not to run for the presidency of his country. And so the whole thing ends up as a sort of an interesting farce, really, with moments of achievement. And there are some wonderful people who've worked for the prosecution, who've been actually much more dedicated to the cause of Bosnia than many journalists and many Bosnian politicians.
Like Florence Hartman.
Florence Hartman, but she wasn't a prosecutor. She was working for the office of the prosecutor. But some of the lawyers, Tiga, who led the Karadzic prosecution. He's been there, ever since the beginning doing this.
And speaking of genocide, you actually made Margaret Thatcher cry, I think, if I'm right.
If I made Margaret Thatcher cry, I didn't make her cry as much as she made me cry. But anyway.
No, I think that's a fascinating achievement in its own right, because basically,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, she criticized was it John Major? John Major, and she basically said, I didn't think that I would see another genocide take place in Europe. Really?
Well, she's right on one thing anyway. There we go.
Well,
yes.
Other than that.
So Margaret Thatcher and I, we both made each other cry. There you are. No, actually, weirdly, she was good on Bosnia. At the time, there was a very weird alliance of people who wanted to intervene from the left, although I don't know whether I'm left or right anymore, but because I don't believe in progress, that's another conversation. But from the sort of left, Susan Sontag, myself, Michael Foot, Ashdown in the kind of centre left, whatever he is or was. On the right, you had Jean Kirkpatrick. On the far right, you had Thatcher. You had a number of people in America. Those of us who believed in intervention in Bosnia, we weren't part of some great imperium project. I was very opposed to Iraq afterwards. But it was a genuine belief that this was not any kind of sort of liberal expansionism or whatever, or US blah blah blah. It was the genuinely held belief, which I think was militarily sound, that if airstrikes had taken out the guns around the 5 major besieged cities in May 1992 and then again in August 1992, when it was suggested, I think this would have stopped. I think 4 or 5 or 6 nights of serious bombardment of artillery positions around Sarajevo, Gorazde, Bihać and the others probably might have stood a chance of stopping Karadzic and Mladic in their tracks.
But there simply wasn't
Instead,
enough.
their hands were clasped under the chandeliers of Paris, London and Washington for 3 fecking years. And that's what drove us mad. That's what drove us crazy. Us, meaning you Bosnians and we who were trying to report this. I mean, it seemed incredible that this could be going on and on and on, massacre after massacre, for 3 long years in the heart of Europe. And then when we switch on the television, we see Douglas Hurd, Lord Carrington, David Owen, Cyrus Vance, and all these people shaking hands again with Karadzic, Milosevic et al. And the generals, Clark and Rose, sitting down for yet another roasted lamb with Mladic. With handshake photo opportunity.
When they asked Bill Clinton why he was so opposed to an intervention, he said it was because he read Balkan Ghosts by Kaplan, which is one of the worst books about the region. I'm sure you must have read it.
Yeah, yes. Well, Clinton, I mean, sort of, I don't know why, I don't know how the Americans got away with it. Actually, somehow the British and the French have quite rightly come out of this as the people who delivered Bosnia to the butchers. But actually, the Americans seem to have managed to come out as the people who kind of, did the big thing in the end and stopped the war. Well, actually, they went along with it all just as much as anybody else. The intelligence work the work that Florence Hartmann has done on the intelligence around the Srebrenica massacre in declassified material shows that actually it was them, if anything. It was Lake and his people. And don't worry, lawyers, I've asked the press him to comment at UNICEF or wherever he refuses to remark. It was actually the Americans who sat down with Milosevic and drew the map that wiped out Srebrenica, Gorazde and Žepa. So they played their part. And, Holbrooke is acclaimed for having forged the Dayton Agreement. But I mean, this will be the theme tonight. I mean, it was a total disaster. It didn't stop the war. It just pressed the pause button.
Absolutely. I think we all
stopping people fighting is not making peace. And that's what I've learned working in Colombia. I've been working in Colombia recently. And there's an attempt to make a real peace at the end of a war that started in 1948. Now, it's very precarious. It's not going very well, but it's there. And they're trying to actually forge a peace, not just draw a line across a country and say, well, the light is red, 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 or whatever Holbrooke said. So the Americans come out of this very badly.
Jim Higgs, who wrote the fantastic Lessons from Sado, writes about the trifecta of the powerless victim and the beastly aggressor and the equally powerless observer. That model of seeing the war, of understanding the war, doesn't seem to work anymore, does it?
No. I mean, if we take Colombia as the latest example of an attempt at peace that might work, it might not, but it might work. If it works, it will be because, A, there is a mass movement that insists upon it. When President Santos of Colombia lost the plebiscite for his peace deal, I mean, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, mostly young, took over every street and square in Colombia, in every city and town, and just said, no, we're not going back to war, we insist on peace. Well, that helps. You've got a political class, which, I don't idolize any political establishment, but I mean, they're pretty intelligent, and they are determined to win this peace. But most important of all, the peace process in Colombia attempts to actually restructure Colombian society. They're using the end of the war to do other things. In Bosnia, with respect to the country and the people, none of these things exist. There is not a mass movement for peace. There is, and I'll say this, there is not an enlightened political class that is determined to win the peace, and there is not an attempt to it was not in Dayton, didn't even mention the restructuring of the country, didn't even talk sufficiently about the economic, and they didn't talk about justice, they didn't talk about economic opportunities. So you have to have all those three. You needed land reform, you needed something that didn't just sort of throw Bosnia to the ravages of corruption and the market.
You come from the land of Brexit. You're here at the same time in Sarajevo as Boris Johnson. How does that make you feel?
Well, Boris Johnson and I have the same passport. I presume he's proud of his. I'm deeply ashamed of mine. I think it's I've been ashamed of it at one level all my life, with the history of empire and famine in Ireland and things. But that's another matter. I mean, with Brexit, it becomes a burning coal in your stomach, or at least in your jacket pocket. Brexit is an abomination at the political level and the level of policy and migration and so on. But it's also corrosive and toxic at a much deeper level. And it repels me. Boris Johnson's come to a country that's been ravaged by ethnic cleansing. Now, Brexit is not going to ethnically cleanse Britain in the way that happened here. But he'll meet lots of kindred spirits, because there are now 3 million of our friends from Europe, Spaniards making coffee, Italians baking pizza, Poles pulling pints. I think it's great to have them around. They are now all scared, and in the end they will all have to go. That's the plan. And others will not be able to come. He thinks that all the kids who sort of smoke dope down at the bus station are going to come and run our National Health Service. Well, good luck. I can't see it myself. But at a deeper level than that, this is about people, the species of human beings who like living with other kinds of people. I like having it around. I don't have a problem with the Portuguese people making my coffee and the Italians making pizza and Poles plastering the walls. He does. He wants to be in the inward-looking, backward-looking, isolated little England. Post-colonial, melancholic, depressed and depressing. But dressed up with, oh, well, jolly good, where is Turkey, Egypt? Oh, carry on. Well, we have the same passport. We're different evolutionary species, he and I. So I'm going to meet my friends here who believe that people should live with the other kind. He's going to meet a lot of people here who don't like that kind of thing, who just want to live with their own. It's repugnant. I've always felt European. Genetically, I'm half Irish. I have French ancestry. We're all minestrone. We're European. I've always felt European. I've always been interested in European football. I've always loved to travel. I've always go by train. I like the food. I like languages, so on and so on. And Bosnia's Europe too. You're European. That's the whole point. That's what we were trying to say to the world during the war. This is happening in Europe. I care about Europe. I want to be in Europe. And Boris Johnson wants to sort of go off into space somewhere across the sea. It's insane. It's mad. Why would Britain, having been part of Europe for most of my lifetime, want to sort of come here to a place that's trying to get into Europe in order to preach the doctrine of distance from this continent to which we all belong?
Talking about the region and the European Union, what do you think is the future of this region?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, because I'm not sufficiently informed. But I'd love to say that from what I do read and follow, that I was optimistic. It's hard to be optimistic because of the stasis. People still are defining themselves ethnically and only ethnically. Not in the way that I was talking about earlier, whereby, as the bass player of Jefferson Airplane said, why can't we all just get along? It's a very good line, very good question. And I think there is a sort of almost, I may have this wrong, but I think that my generation has sort of almost settled into a sort of an agreement that we just don't really like each other very much. And that's sad and bad. It's entirely down to the young generation. It's entirely down to the young people in Serbia, Macedonia, Bosnia, Croatia, and Montenegro, and the people within that country to just say, basta, enough of this crap. You know, we've got other things to think about. We've got climate change to think about. We've got where does the economy go to think about. We've got species extinction, the environment, water. I mean, you know, your generation has too much to worry about to start babbling on about who's a Croat, who's a Bosniak, and who's a Serb. I mean, it just doesn't matter that much. And that has to be, you know, when that line is crossed, then this area, which you call it Yugoslavia, Western Balkans, call it, you know, Tom, Dick and Harry, it doesn't matter. You know, while everybody's defining themselves by their ethnicity and having a problem with the other guy, then all the other things like your economic future of your grandchildren, the environment and these other crucial issues will just get second place, and they shouldn't be in second place.
Mr. Vulliamy, thank you very much for this interview and for your time.
Thank you. That's great.